I'm really honored to be spending the next hour with my panelists and with you. So instead of reading my panelists' bios, I decided to ask them a little question which will serve as introducing themselves. So I'd like to know, what is your connection with the subject that we're going to discuss today? Max.
Thanks, Diane. And hi, everyone. Really great to be here and to discuss what has been most of my life's work, and then also, I think, a really important conversation. And that is how can we adapt food systems to be more responsive to the needs and livelihoods of smallholder farmers. So I first began working in agriculture and rural development back in 2008, which was around the time of a global food price crisis that affected many developing countries and emerging markets. And I think that was what gave me sort of a passion for understanding how we can make food systems more inclusive. A few years of kind of bouncing around between development organizations, I ended up at the World Bank, and then at SOCAP, which is a think tank that's housed within the World Bank, and we focus on financial inclusion for people living in poverty. And over the years at SOCAP, my work has continued to focus on agriculture and rural development. I started out on a team that was looking at financial innovations for smallholder farmers, worked for many years in off-grid energy access, and then also in green asset financing, so looking at how we can get green assets into the hands of people who are typically excluded from a just green transition. And then most recently, I've been spending the last year and a half setting up a new team within SOCAP that looks at how we can build more inclusive carbon markets, specifically looking at financial services as a lever for ensuring that low-income communities can participate and benefit equitably from carbon finance.
Thanks, Max. Dina, what's your connection with the topic?
Okay, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. As Diane has mentioned, I'm Dina, and I'm from Malawi. I work with Community Agribusiness Partners in Malawi, formerly known as the Clinton Development Initiative. So Community Agribusiness Partners works in partnership with farming communities who are focused on leading and continuously learning from each other, and also who partner to benefit from their active participation in the food supply chain. I have worked with farmers in Malawi for more than 10 years, which has allowed me to gain insights into their challenges. And through Community Agribusiness Partners, we partner with farmers to develop solutions that build resilience against the challenges that they face, and also promote sustainable economic growth. So I'm happy to be here to learn and also relearn. Thank you.
Thanks, Dina. What about you, Tim? What's your connection?
Right, so the New York philosopher Frederick Buechner once wrote that the intersection of the world's great need and your great passion is your vocation. So for me, my entire career, my entire life has been one focused on small-scale farmers here in the United States, originally with the United States Department of Agriculture, and then left that to join the U.S. Peace Corps and was placed next door to Dina in Malawi, and that has been home for 17 years, trying to really look and evaluate on what are the core causes and systemic issues that create the word no for farmers who are really trying to increase their yield, increase their income, build up what we would ultimately call rural prosperity. And really taking some of the lessons learned from farmers we've supported here in the US with the Department of Agriculture, and really do a cross-learning. How do we really look at good farming that grows rural economies and continues to grow day in, day out?
Thanks, Tim. As a writer, I know firsthand the power of words and images, and I believe in storytelling. So for my next questions, I want you to help us, all of us in this room, understand the reality of smallholder farmers. We need to be able to imagine their daily lives, their struggle, their challenges related to climate change. So Dina, take us to a smallholder farm.
All right. When you talk about smallholder farmers, or to say small-scale farmers, we're talking of individuals that are cultivating on land that is no bigger than an acre. So these farmers mostly do all their farming operations on their own without requiring additional labor. So like in Malawi, I'll give an example of an imaginary farmer, Chikondi. I like the name Chikondi because it means love in my native language, and it's one of the common names in Malawi. So a farmer like Chikondi wakes up early at 4 a.m. To go to the field to start doing her farming operations. The reason why they wake up that early is because they want to take advantage of the cooler morning weather so that the sun doesn't take a toll on them. So depending on the time of the year, this time is used for making ridges, sowing, weeding, or harvesting. And they take a break around 10:30 or 11 a.m. They go home. If she's a lady, she's going home to prepare lunch. And then after lunch in the afternoon, she's using that time to take care of the livestock if she has any. Or if she's part of a group, they're using the afternoon to go to group trainings. If they're part of a what we call village savings and loan groups, they're using this time to go to meetings for their community banks. And then in the evening, again, depending on the time of the year, it can be the market season, they're using this time to sort out their produce so that it's ready for the market the next day. So as you can see, a farmer's day is full. They are busy, they're hardworking, but they lack access to critical resources that would help them to see the growth in their agribusiness. So they lack access to resources like quality inputs, like seeds and fertilizers. They also lack access to weather information, land, technology, crop insurance, finance, market information, and even markets that would offer them better prices for their produce. And climate change has worsened their conditions, even if like all the enabling conditions for agribusiness were there, like seeds, market, finance. But with climate change and with unstable weather, the whole system is still at risk. So for instance, in Malawi, you would actually see or feel the impacts of climate change. We used to have rivers that were like had perennial flows, but then now they have seasonal flows, which is limiting farmers' ability to irrigate, and therefore their ability to be able to produce more. They are also faced with droughts and floods, unpredictable rainfall patterns, which is also affecting their decisions on when to plant. There are strange pests and diseases that they are challenged with every year attacking their crops, and they don't know how to be able to prevent them. And there's also water loss and also soil loss, which affects their soils and eventually affects the quality and quantity of their production. And all of these issues or conditions or impacts of climate change are leaving their households at risk.
Now, thanks for this story and this storytelling. That was perfect. Let's make the connection between how the daily lives of the smallholder farmers is changing. How is that impacting our global food system?
Dinah, is it okay if I take that one?
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of numbers. Right, but when you the picture that Dinah painted is also a very real picture. If you look at the current USAID definitions of a smallholder farmer, what we're talking about is the amount of land that a family of 5.3 people, on average, can cultivate by hand, right? So it's a very specific number in terms of really what's possible. The other pieces that we know is that smallholder farmers, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, unfortunately, because of the issues that Dinah laid out, are still only on average producing about 20 to 30% of their potential yield on those same farms. At the same time, what we know in terms of why that's important to us in this room, right? So currently, it's over 1/3 of the global food supply is produced by smallholder farmers, right? 1/3 of everything the world eats. If you look at developing countries and developing markets, that's 80% of the food supply. So if we're not talking about these farmers, then we're not actually talking about food production, and we're not talking about food security. You started to go down the same route in terms of what the topic that we've put on the table for this session and Dinah's points about climate change. Like the climate crisis, what we've been seeing in real hand, and I probably should have said this in my introduction, I'm also a permanent resident of the Republic of Malawi, and that's home for me. I'm also a farmer there, as well as helping lead investments into smallholder farmers to increase their yield and their income. For us, our program has been able to see with access to finance, support and networks and training, an average increase of about 56% in yields within the first year for farmers and 67% increases in income. So really exciting in terms of seeing real results. And then all of a sudden, 3 years ago in Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe were hit by what was called Cyclone Anna, which at that point was the strongest tropical storm to ever hit the southern hemisphere. What we saw was those same households that had increased their income, increased their yield, put iron sheets on their houses, everything was gone in a literal weekend. So what can we do was the big question. I think that's really what we're going to be focusing on the rest of the panel. But what I think would be almost more terrifying, and I did warn you, Diane, I'm talkative. That's why I sat as far away from the moderator as possible.
I still can watch.
Yeah, but she was threatening to grab my hand if I overspoke. Cyclone Anna was absolutely horrific. The next year, Cyclone Freddy hit, which now is the strongest storm to ever hit the southern hemisphere. And Cyclone Freddy displaced, just in Malawi alone, 83,000 households. And then the following year with the El Nino-La Nina pattern, the worst soy blight we've ever seen in the nation. This year, continuing issues, and this is country by country throughout the world. This is just one specific example of where we're seeing climate set back the work that I think many of us are trying to focus on in terms of facilitating flows of finances to where they are.
So Dina and Tim express how what's happening to smallholder farmers is a personal tragedy. It's a community tragedy, but it's a global tragedy also. Max, let's talk about the women in smallholder farm.
No, I think it's important to recognize, because we sometimes talk about smallholder farmers as a monolith, right? But first of all, it's important to recognize that the smallholder reality is going to vary according to context, according to the country, the region within a country, the region, the culture, et cetera. But I think what's most important is to also recognize is that in many cases, the realities that women smallholder face are particular and present particular opportunities and challenges vis-a-vis climate change. So first of all, the face of smallholder farming is largely female. In lower income countries, an estimated 79% of economically active women report that agriculture is their primary economic activity. And women are responsible for something like half of the world's food supply, the production of half of the world's food supply in many of these countries. At the same time, women face challenges such as a lack of equal access to resources, whether that's assets, financial resources, time. Women struggle from gendered social norms that may restrict their mobility, restrict their decision-making authority within households. All of this means that they are less able to adapt and become more resilient to increasing climate shocks. In many countries where we work, we see that many men have actually migrated to cities in search of better economic opportunities, leaving women as the primary kind of managers of their farms, and yet they still struggle with those very same challenges: inability to get financing from a bank, gender-based violence that restricts their ability to travel to markets in order to fetch the highest price for their crops. All of this restricts their ability to invest in the things that they need to become more resilient to increasing climate shocks. And I think it's also important to note that there have been studies that have found that if we provided women with the access to the same resources that male smallholders have, we would reduce the number of food insecure in the world by 17%, which is equivalent to 150 million people, just giving women the same resources that men have. And then maybe just in closing, I would also say that we also need to think about youth as a key sort of agent of change when it comes to the increasing climate risk and vulnerability. What we see in many lower income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is this incredible youth bulge, right? What could be a demographic dividend, as you may have heard that term. But in reality, climate is reducing economic opportunities in rural areas and forcing young men and women to have to migrate to urban areas, to leave the country. And what that means is that the future of food is literally leaving. And there are opportunities to invest in sustainable, profitable livelihoods for young people in rural areas, but it's just not happening. And climate is going to exacerbate that challenge. So I think it's an all of the above priority. I mean, we need to focus on all of these things, but really focusing on women and focusing on youth is going to be critical to ensuring that food systems become more resilient to climate change and ensure global food security.
Thanks, Max. I want to talk philosophy, ethic, and moral now. To what extent are these farmers responsible for climate mitigation and adaptation? What is the moral case for impact capital to help these farmers cope with that reality? Let's start with you, Tim.
All right, I'll pursue brevity this time. Responsibility is a really tricky word here, right? So there's a really important case to be made around climate justice in terms of who's creating emissions versus who's responsible. At the same time, that is really the dialogue around mitigation. So at the same time, there's adaptation, right? So if we're looking at the moral case of who's caused what, and there's we held a climate summit, climate and adaptation summit, just with 15 people, and I think, Randy, you came to that as well. We flew a few people to Oxford. We met at a Quaker meeting house. And then we did the math of how many farmers would have to change their agricultural practices to offset our climate conference. There's a very important case made there. Ours was about 867 farmers. For about 5 years would need to change their practices. I think there's a big multiple for the conference here right now in terms of what that would look like. At the same time, when we look at the impact of the climate crisis, who actually suffers the most, it is always the poor who suffer the most. So when we look at where we're putting our focus for ourselves at Opportunity, it is entirely on the adaptation side. How do we ensure that farmers are more secured against an ever-changing environment? When we look right now in terms of market systems and investments that are happening for climate finance, for smallholder farmers, it's about 0.8% in total around the globe that actually is going to the people that produce a third of the global food supply. At the same time, that's almost entirely focused on mitigation. So helping those small farmers offset our livelihoods. So I think making sure that we mention environmental justice is really key here.
And Max, what about adaptation? You wanted to mention mitigation, sorry.
No, I mean, I think Tim scooped me a little bit there, but no.
You can continue.
No, but I think I completely agree, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the burden of the accelerating climate crisis is on those who have contributed the most to it, right? And that's all of us. That's our parents, our grandparents. And increasingly, it's going to be our children as well, unless we change course. But what we cannot do is place the burden of mitigation on people who probably in an entire lifetime would never even come close to equaling the emissions that I release just flying here from DC, right? That said, I do think that although I would argue, and I'm sure that both of my colleagues here would agree, that there is an incredible dearth of adaptation financing right now in emerging markets and developing economies. I mean, much of what we see of the already insufficient climate financing that is flowing to the global south is going towards mitigation. But what we also can see is that mitigation can have a link to adaptation, and mitigation can also provide better development outcomes, particularly for rural populations. What do I mean? A green transition generally, that we have evidence that a green transition can contribute to multiple development outcomes, whether it's rural women improving their health outcomes because they switch from cooking over wood-burning stoves, so burning biomass, to cleaner cooking technologies, whether it's improving soil quality by using regenerative agriculture practices. That sequesters carbon in the soil, but for the farmer, the big benefit is that now their soil quality is improved, it's more stable, it's more resilient to things, shocks like droughts. So all of that to say that there is an opportunity around mitigation, and there's increasingly a link between mitigation and adaptation resilience. For example, I was just a couple weeks ago with a company in Nairobi that manufactures and finances solar irrigation pumps. And their irrigation pumps obviously are contributing to mitigation. They're shifting farmers away from using diesel, but they also create a 5-fold increase in farmer incomes, increase their resilience to droughts, and just generally, and also enable farmers to move into other types of agricultural activities like animal husbandry, raising livestock. So there is that link between mitigation and adaptation, so it's not a sort of mutually exclusive choice. But I would agree that the priority should be, if we are talking about mitigation in a smallholder agriculture context, it should be not a focus on them cleaning up our mess, but rather how does mitigation actually improve their lives and livelihoods?
Thanks, Max. So as a solution journalist, I want to make sure that you leave with solution. We have talked about the problem, now let's talk about the possible solutions. So how can impact finance contribute to the solution? Dina.
Okay, I believe impact finance is a holistic approach to mitigate, or for farmers to adapt and mitigate the effects of climate change. The reason why I'm saying this is because it's coming from experience of working with farmers in Malawi, and the things that we've done that has helped them to be able to mitigate the effects of climate change. We have developed a loan program that we provide to farmers, because one of the challenges that I mentioned earlier is that farmers are failing to access finance. They fail to access finance as a group, and it's very hard for individual farmers to access finance. So what we do is we provide them like startup loans, so that they're building a credit record that the financiers are looking for that would enable them to be able to access finance. And we also realize that financiers don't want to work with groups that are not registered, because it doesn't give them the surety that they need that the loans are going to be repaid. So we bring farmers together in groups, we get them trained and registered as cooperatives so that they're operating as business entities. Therefore, giving the financiers the confidence that they need to be able to partner with a group that's running their farming operations as a business. And then we have also been able to, through the Inca loan program that I mentioned, we've been able to develop that loan record that the financiers are looking for, so that farmers can be able to access a form of financing. So that credit record, we present it to the bank, like a sort of recommending which groups they should consider for finance. And that has helped them to be able to access finance. And we've also, together with farmers and the financiers, we've developed loan products that are good for farmers. So there are 2 loan products, I mean there are 3. One is the business loan, another one is early grain purchase loan, and then there's also the production loan. So for the production loan, what we do is, because at this time of the year, because like in Malawi right now, farmers are preparing to plant. So at this time of the year, most of them are desperate. Some of them do not have food because they sold everything, or whatever was left, now it's gone. So if they have any access to money, they would use that to meet their immediate needs. So for that reason, we work with partners like input suppliers, so that the money doesn't go straight to farmers' pockets. Rather, it goes to that input supplier that they want, that they have to identify, because it's them that says, okay, I want like soybeans seeds, I want maize seeds, or I want fertilizers. So the bank makes that payment to that input supplier that they've identified, and then they will just go there and pick up their seeds or their fertilizers. That way, we are sure that the production loans are being used for the intended purpose. And now the early grain purchase loan, they're very important, because at harvest, farmers are coming from a lean period. They don't have money, and therefore, they just want to sell their produce. So the early grain purchase loan helps them to be able to sell their produce early, but also to sell it at a competitive price. Like they can sell it at the prevailing market price, but then later, because they're part of a cooperative, a business entity, the cooperative holds that product and then sell it later when the prices are at peak, therefore benefiting the cooperative members. So that's how that loan is being used. And then the business loan now, it's used to cover for that lean period, so that farmers are not desperate. They're able to do some businesses as they wait for their crops to harvest. Because you'd feel very sad if you were to visit Malawi around January, February. Farmers will literally sell their crops before they harvest. They don't even know how much yield they're going to have from a farm. But because they're desperate, they'll just charge anyhow, they'll sell it off. Or sometimes they would say, give me like maybe $50. $50 can be an equivalent to one bag, and then I'll repay $150 in grain. So they don't accept cash, they'll accept grain. So by doing that, they are losing out because by the end of the day, the prices will go up. By the time that they are selling, it's no longer $150, it's more than that. So that's why the aid grain purchase loan and also the business loan is very important to farmers, and that's what we've helped them do. And also the loans are, the repayment period is scheduled in the way that it's aligning with farmers' cash flows. So we also work together with the farmers and the financiers to be able to align that with their cash flows so that we are avoiding the default rate. And our partnership with Opportunity International has also helped a lot because with Opportunity International, farmers have been able to get that reduction on interest rates. And also the collateral requirement has also reduced because of the financing that Opportunity International is able to provide to the banks that's targeting smallholder farmers. So that has played a critical role in having farmers being able to access huge sums of money, and they've also been able to repay it. And from the time that we've gotten the support from Opportunity International, we've consistently achieved a 100% repayment rate. So no farmer group has defaulted on the loans that they've accessed so far from the banks. And that has given the banks confidence. They're actually coming now to farmers to say, are you going to access a loan this time around? This is our offer. So they have like several financiers now that are willing to partner with them and work with them. And also another thing that we see, like with impact financing, we talk about sustainable agriculture or regenerative agricultural practices. Without finance, it can just be a training that they'll go to because they've been in so much training, so many of them, but they don't have now the financial muscle that they need for them to be able to implement the practices that you're teaching them. So when they are accessing finance, they are able to do crop rotation, they're able to do intercropping. Like right now, most of the farmers that we're working with are interested in macadamia nuts. So with macadamia nuts, they can intercrop them with pretty much any crop. And eventually, they'll be able to sell the macadamias themselves and also be able to make profits from the other crops that they are growing. But then that requires them to access finance for them to be able to practice these things that you are training them. So like I said earlier, impact finance is a holistic approach, and it helps farmers to be able to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change.
Thanks, Dina. Tim, let's continue with the instrument of the impact finance. When we did the prep call, you talked about the challenges of grants and commercial investment. So let's continue on that.
Yeah, so, okay, global standard, right? Sustainable development goals. Really ambitious, signed on by so many countries around the world. And what it will actually take to achieve those goals is roughly $3.9 trillion per year. All the governments, green climate funds, philanthropic funds, pooled together leave about $2.5 trillion missing from what's actually needed to achieve those goals. You compare that and you start to look at the finance market around the globe. That's currently about $98 trillion, right? So the capacity of finance to unlock what our governments, what our better selves want to actually achieve is something that we believe really strongly in. Really, how do we start to, though, address risk and actually unlocking that is a huge question. And Dinah touched a little bit on some of our methodologies, thank you, Dinah, on our side, but what we found is that there are two major inhibitors, right? If you go to any commercial banker, I'd say in the world, not just in Africa, anywhere in the world, and you mention agriculture finance, you almost get beaten out of the room talking about risk, right? How do you manage this? They don't have common collaterals. We can't put their land as chattels. We can't claim anything. We have no visibility on their cash flows. So a lot of our work at Opportunity and what we've built partnerships for and what we're now launching, what we're calling the Climate Collateral Alliance, is as we look at month-by-month performance of loans over the last, say, 5 years that we're able to facilitate through local, already registered functional financial institutions to do last-mile distribution, we can actually place deposits to act as collateral that earn returns at the standard rate, and as a result are able to buy down the collateral requirements that those farmers need to be able to represent. So it's us saying we believe so strongly in these farmers and their practices that we want to essentially, like many of us when we bought our first cars, someone would put down the deposit to help us purchase that vehicle. So how do we move past that hurdle, particularly when it's farmers that want to practice regenerative agriculture? And it's not in any way to say that regenerative agriculture is a unicorn, but really how do we look at that as a standard set of principles where we're looking at locally led adaptation as a result through that. So I might pause there just because I know I've already overspoken on my few minutes.
Continue with the broad picture of the role of sustainable finance in agriculture for smallholder farmer, and you will introduce also us to the carbon market.
Sure. Well, that's a big ask because it's not exactly the most straightforward, transparent thing to talk about. Well, let me first off start by saying so SOCAP, we're a member-based organization, and so many of our members include development finance institutions, bilateral donors, multilateral development banks, private foundations, investment funds, et cetera. And so one of the things that we've learned over the years is whether or not smallholder farmers gain access to the vital services they need, including financial services, really depends on access to capital. So the sort of businesses, financial institutions that are trying to provide these solutions in last mile rural areas, they require access to the right sort of capital. There needs to be the right capital stack in place, right, in order to enable some of the most innovative, inclusive solutions at the last mile. And what we've learned working with some of our members is the sort of role that various kind of these players in that capital stack can play. And I think, first off, is the need to de-risk some of these investments, right, in innovative organizations, business models at the last mile. One of the things that we hear time and time again, right, is just what you were saying, right, is this kind of perception of risk. And sure, I say perception because often the true risk is exaggerated, right? For example, I talked about women before. Women smallholders are among the most credit-worthy clients. If you analyze microfinance institution portfolios, right, around the globe, who are the best repayers? It's women, right, and often rural women. They are very committed to repaying their credit. And yet there's this perception, oh, well, she doesn't have formal land title, and therefore, what happens if she defaults? I have no collateral. How do you overcome that, right? I mean, first is education, right? But second, it's helping to de-risk capital and crowd in commercial investment. Because ultimately, philanthropic capital, concessional capital, et cetera, is not going to be enough alone to actually scale and reach the estimated 500 million smallholder farmers around the globe, right? So what it's about is catalyzing that commercial financing to actually crowd into to many of these markets. And so, development finance institutions have a role to play, first loss guarantees. Impact investors can work together with donors, private foundations to develop blended finance facilities, right? Where you can actually bring down the cost of capital, reduce risk for commercial investors, and then prove it, right? So that's the big thing. Once these things are proven, once there is that track record, people will crowd in. And I think the last thing I'll say, because I'm already way over time, is that in many of these contexts, one of the big challenges is market failures, right? We always think, we are big believers in capitalism and the market is going to be able to solve all of these problems, but the reason why people continue to live in poverty, face unequal access to resources, face extreme vulnerability to climate change is because market systems have failed them. And that's because infrastructure does not exist to actually get crops to market. Education and information services don't exist so that people understand the newest techniques, technologies like regenerative agriculture. They can't make effective
decisions about which crops to grow and what's going to fetch the highest prices because they don't have access to commodity exchanges to understand what the price of a given crop will be next year. And so we need to solve those issues before commercial capital is going to be able to really solve the problem. And that's where donors, philanthropists, the development community, including many of the members of my organization, need to play the role to build that foundation. And that in turn can unlock the sort of high-level change at scale that we really need to adapt food systems.
Is it time for the questions? No, okay. So can you help me? Just tell me how long we have, because I want to know if we have time for the carbon market or not. Oh. 5 minutes. I think we go.
I got too into that answer.
No, but
I completely forgot the carbon markets bit.
We have to make a decision because we should talk about impact and outcomes.
Please.
So do we skip the carbon market, or can you do that in 1 minute?
Well, all I'll say is this, and we have a report coming out on November 5th, so next week, for those who want to hear my long-form answer. But I talked earlier about how mitigation is not sort of the primary objective when we're talking about smallholder agriculture. Where we landed after a lot of debate over whether it made sense to actually focus on carbon finance was that while right now climate financing is not reaching the most vulnerable and those who are most in need, right now what we see is the structure of the voluntary carbon market is such that 15 times more credits are currently being issued from emerging markets than developed countries. And that's where the demand for these credits is. There is an opportunity, if we do it right, to leverage carbon markets to deliver climate financing to those who need it most. The challenge is, how do we make these markets inclusive and really make sure that it's the people who are actually responsible for avoiding or removing carbon from the atmosphere, that they own that and that they own the revenues from that and can actually improve their lives through that. So I'll leave it at that, but just to say that that's something that we're working on, and I encourage you all to reach out. I would love to talk carbon more if it's of interest.
That's good. I just didn't want to skip the impact part, because in the impact investing, there is the investing word, but there is the impact word also. So let's talk about impact and outcomes. The big question is always the same. How do we align the interest of the investors, of the smallholder farmers, and the community? Is that possible? Have you seen that? How do we do that? Let's start with you, Dinah.
Firstly, I would want to say that these climate change issues that we're talking about, we need to be aware that farmers know them better than most of us here. They know the impact that climate change has on the environment. They're aware of the solutions that they need to take for them to be able to mitigate the effects. But all they need is for them to be incentivized. So, and how do we do that? Like, for instance, like I mentioned earlier, helping them to be able to access finance. The reduction in the collateral requirement is one of the incentives that we can provide to them so that they can easily access finance. The access, he mentioned, talked about access to markets that are offering competitive prices, like the end buyer market, that will incentivize them to want to produce quality and quantity production. And for investors, I would say that if you can consider to invest, if you can consider like unrestricted funding, that would allow people like us to be able to run programs like the input loan program that I mentioned earlier, that unlocks finance for farmers. That would be very good, because restricted funding also restricts us in the way that we are providing support to the groups that are working with. And therefore, there's no sustainability in the work that we're doing. Instead of us spending like maybe 3 to 5 years in a community, you find us being in that community for more than 5 years, which is not sustainable. Then what are we doing? Because we want to be able to see progress. If we are here this year, next year we should be able to say that this is how we found this community, and now they're able to do A, B, C, D because of all these things that we're able to do with them. But then if funding is restrictive, we also become very aware of the funder requirements, therefore not being able to take a step further to help farmers to become resilient to climate change.
Tim, how do we align the interest of those three groups?
Yeah, so a very common expression that's used in investors and financial institutions, development partners, donors around the world is when they talk about farmers, they talk about mindset change. What I think needs to be talked more is about for investors, development partners, financial institutions, we need to change our mindsets. A lot of organizations will call farmers beneficiaries. They won't call them clients. So in terms of aligning impact and outcomes, how do we make sure that our work, our research, our gross margin analyses, our focus group discussions treat farmers as clients and take their perceptions as the lead of our work? So what we found when we started going into large numbers of persona development for design is farmers coming to us and saying, I remember the farm that my grandparents had. I remember the worms in their soil. I remember how much water could be held in that. And what I see now is not my farm looking like that. What I see is an absolute dependence on inorganic fertilizers that I keep investing more into every year, and yet my yields are going down. Right? So taking that mindset and saying, why don't we design with just some few principles and let our clients decide what they want to do with that capital, because they know what's best for their farms. So when we look at regenerative agriculture and we look at the impact that we're already now starting to see, right? Our entire hypothesis, our thesis for the Climate Collateral Alliance was saying it's going to take, on our estimate, about 6 to 7 years for farmers to adopt these practices, and there's going to be a dip in their productivity. So we really need to build this investment risk capital to be able to help them overcome that transition period. In the first year, we saw a near doubling in yield for farmers that are willing to make that transition because we failed to assess how diminished their current soils actually are. So really letting them lead is how we start to see impact. Diane pulled me aside before the session and asked me what I thought about this near cult-like obsession we have with scale. And as I'm sitting here thinking about that, right, there's a John Maxwell quote where he said, collaboration is multiplication. And what it takes for us to see impact at scale is for us to get out of the way, right? How do we look at partnerships? When we look at collateral easement options like what we were talking about with Dinah and how to reduce collateral requirements, that was kicked off in a partnership with the Visa Foundation, who said, we're interested in women who are in agriculture in 5 different countries. How can we pilot this and make this work? And that was absolutely amazing for us. And it's not just for us. How do we convey those same learnings to the rest of the industry? Same now with Cisco Foundation, who is just extremely excited about regenerative agriculture and getting banks to finance it. And really saying, how do we collaborate so it's not just us that are benefiting and elbowing everyone else out of the way, but actually making an impact that is affecting our global food systems. Same with Government of Jersey, who's been phenomenal in terms of how do we leverage locally owned community finance, and how do we invest in that so that we see the leverage doubling and tripling from what we were doing before. So hopefully, Diane, that's the remainder of the conversation you and I started before this panel.
So from beneficiaries to clients, like I said earlier, word counts. They make a difference. First, you change the word you use, then you change the posture. But first, you have to change the word to change the posture and the mindset. Max, how do we align the interest of those two groups?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that what we have been increasingly trying to argue is that investing in climate adaptation is not just good for smallholder farmers, it's good for business. Because at the end of the day, especially for a financial institution, if your portfolio includes a number of climate-exposed clients, and they face a major shock, then it's your business that's going to suffer, right? It's your portfolio at risk that's going to...
It's a concentration risk as well.
Concentration risk as well. And so by helping your customers to adapt, you're actually improving your business, right? And especially, you told the story about regenerative agriculture and how after a year you saw doubling of yields.
Well, you know what? That those farmers are probably going to want to take out bigger loans next year because now they're making more money, right? So that's good for your bottom line as well. So, we talk a lot about this cliche of people, profit, planet, but it can be a real thing, especially when we're talking about smallholder agriculture. I like to tell a story. There's a small nonprofit microfinance bank that we work with in India called SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association. They serve largely very, very low-income rural women who have never had access to formal financial services. And they offer a range of different loans tied to mitigation as well. So they're actually doing work lending for biodigesters, solar irrigation pumps, et cetera. One of the things that we are helping them to design and introduce is what they call Insurance Plus Plus, which is a heat index insurance product. Because these women can't work when it's too hot outside, that means that they lose income, right? And increasingly, as we know, the number of extremely hot days are becoming more and more frequent and more intense. This insurance product essentially helps to compensate them on days where they're unable to work because of the heat. What does that mean? Well, now they're better able to repay their loans. So that's good business for the microfinance institution. It's good for the customers. So again, like I said, climate adaptation and resilience investments in that are good for business.
Okay, so let's start the Q&A. Adapt or collapse is a fairly terrifying title. I agree with that. On the other hand, what gives you hope for the future? Dina.
The hope that I have for the future is based on what I see in the communities that we work with. Once farmers have been able to be given all these resources, there's a transformation that is so evident. Tim explained about the doubling of yields. There is also a change at looking their farming as just a source of, just producing enough to feed their livelihoods to producing for the market. So they look at farming as a business. So as they're looking at farming as a business, they're looking into how can I be able to make more profits? How can I make my business more profitable? Or how can I expand my business? So that helps them to be able to want to continue to grow each and every day. But then when they are producing on a small scale, it's very hard for them to have that mindset to say, I can be able to grow this because they don't produce much. So for the future, I see that there's hope. There's going to be an increase in production. There's going to be a lot of farmers that are actually not even the smallholder farmers, even in Malawi, people like me, they're getting into farming because they've seen that it's very profitable. So if people are leaving their jobs getting into farming, that should say something to a farmer. There's something that they're missing out. So the future is going to be very competitive. I'm sure we're going to have surpluses in the future. Yeah.
Tim, where does the hope lie?
So I think on this panel, and many of our colleagues around the world have the privilege of serving some of the hardest working, most risk-saturated, and most durable individuals in the world. So for me, my constant inspiration comes from the farmers that we get the privilege to work with, seeing how much day after day they will continue to get up before the sun to form their ridges and feed their families and feed us. But then when we look to what Max said about what's being called the youth bulge, I prefer the youth dividend, really what's possible, right? So Prime Minister of Ethiopia last month said 75% of all farmers in the world are women and youth, right? So the level of innovation that's coming from that side, we just, almost on a whim, we're having conversations with a couple of our, what we call farmer support agents, lead farmers, locally selected, and they came up with this idea just playing with ChatGPT of how could we use artificial intelligence to give us agricultural recommendations that aren't hallucinating, that are fit for us. This was with the soy blight issues in Malawi, and they were getting information about things that farmers in Iowa should do, and they said, well, what about us? And it was literally their innovation that spurred us to, for almost nothing, form a partnership with the Ministry of Agriculture, exclusively run that engine on that same content, and deploy at the equivalent of about 5 cents per farmer per year. And just the inspiration that we get from listening to the farmers we serve, that's a pretty easy one for me.
What about you, Max?
I mean, I'd like to say that Tim and Dinah, that your stories, I mean, the work that you do in countries like Malawi is what gives me a lot of optimism and hope. But I would say that what gives me the most optimism is the incredible dynamism that we've seen over the last decade or so in terms of the innovation space in many emerging markets. I travel a lot for work to sub-Saharan Africa. I spend a lot of time in a number of developing countries, and it used to be that we kind of always thought, and this gets to your sort of point around the beneficiaries versus clients. We always thought, we need to bring in our technology and our solutions, and basically because people there are incapable of doing it for themselves. But I think now what you see is a lot of the innovation, the most promising new solutions are locally led, are coming from the African continent, from Latin America, from Southeast Asia. And I think that what you're going to see in the coming years is that we are not best positioned to tell a smallholder farmer in Malawi how she should be best protecting her environment, right, or developing strategies for adapting to a changing climate, but rather she's going to be the one who's teaching us, right, and teaching her neighbors. And I think that that's what gives me optimism, is that it's not all on our shoulders to solve this problem, but it's the people who are living this day to day. If they're equipped with the right tools, technologies, access to resources, they're going to solve it for themselves, and I think teach all of us a thing or two in the process.
Before going with your closing remarks, I would like to share my insight from this conversation. I feel this sense of connection. This panel made me realize something I knew with my head, the connection between what we eat every day and the livelihood, the life of the smallholder farmers in Africa, in America, in Asia, how what we eat is related to the life they have or they have not. And we have a contribution with our expertise, with our money, depending where we come from. But so there's this connection that is so important to realize that we have with the smallholder farmers. Now I'd like to go with the closing remarks. So, Dina, what do you want people to leave this room with?
I would say that I want people to know that the smallholder farmers are so passionate about their farming, and they are very willing to be able to respond to the effects that are affecting their farming, because it's hard for them to be able to invest all this time, invest their resources, but then to come up empty-handed. So when we are approaching them, we need to know that they are individuals that are just vulnerable, but then if we provide them with the resources that they need, and we actually sit down with them, ask them, what is it that they need? Not detecting what they need, we'll be able to come up with solutions that are sustainable, and we'll be able to see a change that we'd like to see in the communities that we're working with.
Tim?
So many things to close with. It's a hard one with this topic. What stands out to me is a conversation actually Randy Kurtz and myself were having with Jim Pullen from the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. And we started talking about these different investment mechanisms, and I was starting to get riled up because some of the team at DFC were talking about subsidies. And I said, well, I mean, we're currently sitting in one of the most subsidized agricultural markets in the world, I think second only to South Korea. And yet we're talking about smallholder farmers who have to compete with global subsidies. So to your point about market failures. And Jim just kind of slowly looked up and said, well, what we're actually talking about is making sure that the grandchildren of today's farms can still have farms to inherit. So for me, that's really what I see as most passionate about. How do we invest, finance, manage risk, so that farmers can really adapt to a climate that is no longer in their benefit, and really see those adjustments. So that's pretty motivating for me.
Max.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I guess that what I would close in saying is, I was at another panel earlier that was talking about how something like, I don't remember the exact, it was like 50% of all mitigation finance is currently going to e-mobility. Even though, yeah, and it got me thinking, I mean, I wonder what the percent is that's going to adaptation, climate adaptation in smallholder agriculture. And I know, there are probably a lot of investors, impact investors in this room, and we were talking earlier about the role that patient and risk capital can play. I mean, this is the role. I know that it can be, especially sitting here in San Francisco, really sexy to want to invest, to invest in the newest, e-commerce app in Nigeria. But the fact of the matter is that, the big, even though you might not see the immediate opportunity for returns, if you can fix these fundamental problems facing our global food system, the returns not just financially, but in terms of impact, are going to be astronomical. And so, if we don't do it, I don't know who else is going to.